session is to introduce this book, India and Malaysia, Intertwined Strands, and its author, Veena Sikri. Now, before I introduce her, allow me to introduce myself. I happen to be a naval officer, a retired naval officer. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have been in such distinguished but selected company. But I'm here for two reasons. One is that I happen to know Veena Sikri. Our paths crossed many years ago. In fact, I first met her when she was High Commissioner in Malaysia. A few years later, I saw her again when she was serving in Dhaka. In both cases, I was very impressed to see that one of our diplomats commanded such high regard and respect, not only from the hosts, but she had great credibility in New Delhi. And she did a fine job under difficult circumstances. So she's one of our outstanding diplomats. I didn't suspect that she had literary inclination. Maybe I wasn't observant enough. But obviously she has. Now she's a Ford Foundation professor in Jamia Millia. And she wrote this book while she was a fellow in Singapore at the Institute for South Asia Studies. That was on a personal note. My other reason for making sure I came this morning was that this subject is of great interest to me. I was chairman of the National Maritime Foundation a few years ago, and the lack of a coherent maritime history of India was a nagging issue for us. And I'll tell you the reason for it. Day before yesterday we celebrated Navy Day. And as some of you know, India is an emerging economic power, it's a nuclear power, it's also going to be a maritime power. And one of the questions that crops up, especially with foreign analysts and strategic commentators, is why does India need a navy? You're a continental power, your threats are all from the mountains, from the Himalayas, you're a poor developing nation. The question that they ask, a very pertinent question, is do you have a maritime tradition? Do you have a maritime history to underpin this huge expense of building a new navy? And often we don't have an answer, because there is in fact very sparse maritime history. You can count on the fingers of one hand the number of people who dabbled in maritime history. Veena is going to join the distinguished ranks of, say, K.M. Panikkar or Sridhar or Mukherjee. And I'll just take a little bit of your time to tell you why I say this. A few years ago, when I was serving, I visited Indonesia for a 3 or 4 day visit. On the first day, I went to a place called Surabaya, and they took me to a submarine, Indonesian submarine. Very impressive. When I came out, I said, what's the name of this submarine? So this escort said it's called Pasupati. So I thought maybe an Indonesian word. So I said, what does it mean? So he looked quite surprised. He said, don't you know it's another name for Lord Shiva? Then I met an Indonesian admiral and I asked him, I said, what are your sailors wearing? A very nice looking badge. He said, this is a mythological weapon of the gods called Brahmastra. Again, I felt embarrassed. And then he went on to explain, he says, you see our badge, the Navy badge? It says Jal Seva Jaya Mahe, Sanskrit, which stands for we are glorious at sea. So wherever you go in Southeast Asia, whether it's Myanmar or Thailand or Cambodia, Indonesia, Bali, there is this deep imprint of Indian culture, Indian civilization, religion, you name it, like languages. How did it happen? This book will tell you, but let me just briefly say that it couldn't have happened except for the fact that for 2,000 to 3,000 years, Indian seamen, sailors, seafarers, religious teachers, traders were continuously toing and froing across the stormy waters of the Bay of Bengal. And if that can't happen unless you have a deep maritime tradition. So we do have a maritime tradition, it's just that Indians are averse or are incapable of writing history, and that is the service that Veena has performed. So without wasting any more time, let me ask Veena to come into this discussion. Now, Veena, when I took over National Maritime Foundation, I met Romila Thapar. And I said, look, can you help us write maritime history? So we had a long discussion. She knocked back a few gin and tonics. And then she told me it's a very difficult proposition. Don't even think about it. Then there's a chap called Gavin Menzies. He's an English author. I don't know if you have come across. He wrote a book called 1421. It's a glorification of the Chinese maritime tradition. So I wrote to him, I said, can you help us He said, Admiral, there are 9 or 10 maritime states of India, starting from Gujarat to West Bengal. Each has a different language. Your maritime history is buried in temple inscriptions and religious tracts and so on. It's almost an impossible task. You mentioned in your book, saying that although you mentioned India's seafaring tradition, shipbuilding tradition, trade, commerce, and you say that it's very difficult to find primary sources, and yet you've done such an excellent job. Would you like to tell this small gathering how you went about collecting such an authentic account?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arun, for that very warm introduction and for really telling us so much about your own experience, which is very valuable. Yes, I must tell you that the reason why I wrote this book, because when I was a High Commissioner in Malaysia for 3 years, I was really struck by the absence of any knowledge about the interaction between India and Malaysia in the pre-colonial period. And it was quite amazing that it seemed as if history began with the British taking the plantation labour from Tamil Nadu to Malaya. And before that there was nothing. And I knew it was very different. And I travelled in Malaysia, and there, sure enough, in the north of Malaysia, you had ancient Hindu temples dating back to the 4th century. Now, how did they come there? And then I read about, you go to Cambodia, you go to Angkor Wat, you know that there were these wonderful interactions. There were the Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms of this area. And then there is an excellent book written by a Dutch person, Coedes, which was translated fairly recently, which is about the Indianized states of Southeast Asia. And he describes how the people from India came there for trade. That is why the first section of my book, which deals with the pre-colonial period, is described as trade, religion and culture. Because trade was the motivating force. And religion and culture went along with it. The people who went there, they were the people who were involved in trade. There was no colonial interaction at all, because there was never a hub and spoke relationship between that place, wherever it was, in Cambodia or Malaya and India. It was trade. You bought something, you went inside, you intermarried, you lived there and came back. Then the next question arose, how did this take place? Because obviously this trade went back more than 2,000 years. And much more than 2,000 years. And so that's what excites my curiosity. And you mentioned the name of Radha Kumar Mukherjee. He wrote a book on this 100 years ago. In 1912, in fact, his book was published in London by none other than a British company, Longmans being a very famous publishing house. And that book was completely forgotten about, because he went into the details about how to learn about India's naval and maritime tradition. In 50 years later, 1962, that book was first published in India by Mahel. Now, going into that book, you get a lot of sources. You learn, for example, that when Alexander the Great came to India in the 4th century BC, he had a lot of writers and historians who came with him. And they have described the Indian Navy and our naval tradition. And they have described, they were very famous people. They were, like Lucius Flavius Arrianus and Quintus Curtius and others. They wrote about the kind of shipping there was, the shipbuilding activity of India, how these ships were so strong, and there were all kinds of ships. There were seafaring ships, the blue navy as we call it. There were ships which went on the rivers, but at that time our rivers were so navigable that some ships could even go right inland and then go outside. So you had this knowledge about the navy. And then you had the Manusmriti, which came between 200 BCE, 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD, somewhere in that period. It also wrote in great detail about India's maritime tradition. And do you know, it also describes maritime insurance. The Manusmriti has a description even of maritime insurance. How do you fix the rates? And how the rate of interest on bottom rate has to be done by people who have conducted a certain number of sea voyages, so they know how these rates of maritime. So you can imagine that if a 2nd century BC text is talking about maritime insurance, then certainly they knew what the Navy was all about. And then you had the text of Kautilya's Arthashastra. Now the Arthashastra is a text written in the 4th century BC, but it was discovered, the Arthashastra and another Sanskrit text called Yukti Kalpaturu, which is a very, very interesting text, which was again the Yukti Kalpaturu, which was a Sanskrit text written by King Bhoj of Madhya Pradesh. Again, both these texts were discovered only about 100 years ago, or let's say translated. They existed, but they were translated, brought into the common knowledge less than 100 years ago. Now, what does the Arthashastra say? The Arthashastra describes the post. It's a description of administrative structure. It describes one of the 40 departments. There were 40 administrative departments of the government at that time. One of them is called the Navadhyaksh. Now, this Navadhyaksh, the chief of the navy, was the most important department, and he describes it as a combination of 4 tasks. The person who held the post of Navadhyaksh was the admiral of the fleet, he was the head of the coast guard, he was the head of the merchant navy, and he was the officer in charge of all the inland river shipping. And under him he had, of course, 4 separate officers heading these departments. So you can imagine that in the 4th century BC, you had a person called the Navadhyaksh who headed these 4 well-defined departments. So it is very clear from all of these that India's naval tradition stretched back much, much more than 2000 years.
So why the reluctance to write history?
Now let me tell you about this. I think, again, when you come down, then I'll tell you just 2 quick things about how it is. The Lothal excavation. Again, Lothal excavation. The Lothal port in Gujarat was excavated only in the 1950s. But that port has existed for 4,500 years. That port is the outlet for the river Saraswati, which dried up. And that was one of the biggest ports. It had dry docks, it had all kinds of navy. Now, again, I told you about the Yukti Kalpataru, which describes ships, what kind they are, how they are to be built. For example, it says that a ship must be built without using nails. Why? Because when you go into the sea, there is a magnetic radiation in the sea, and it can affect the ship and its direction. All this is specified. Now, when the British came, they knew about India's traditions, and they not only knew, but they benefited from it. They set up the Bombay Marine, they set up the Bengal Marine. And in the Bengal Marine, there's a register of the ships built in India under British times. In fact, there are writings by British naval officers where they've said that the Indian teak-made ships lasted 4 times as long as the British oak-wood-made ships. And they were 25% of the cost of construction. So obviously when the British first came, before 1857, which was the first war of independence, before that, when they really were benefiting, when you had East India Company, highly commercial, they found these ships very good, and they bought even 20-year-old Indian ships for Indiaman, that they were called, who bought and taken into the Indian Navy and served well. When they set up this Bengal Marine, there is a register of ships built on the Hooghly from 1781 to 1839. Do you know that there were 376 big ships built there in this period? And out of these ships, 237 were built in 20 years, between 1801 and 1821, amounting to 100,000 tons worth of ship, dead weight of ship. At the average cost of 200 rupees per ton, this is recorded in this register, it's 200 rupees per ton, gave 2 crores and more to the Indian economy and jobs for hundreds of thousands of people in the state of Bengal, in Bengal, undivided Bengal. So you can imagine, but then the moment the British took political control after 1857, there were discussions in Parliament. They found that the Indian shipbuilding industry was affecting the British shipbuilding industry. Laws began to be passed discriminating against Indian shipping. And in 1840, even in 1840, already a bill was passed where they said that we have to make sure that only British-built ships come to British ports. Then they passed another bill saying that Indian sailors will not be allowed in British ports. Then they passed another bill that India-British trade can only be done in British waters. And with the result that after 1840, this entire wherewithal at the Bengal Marine, which included places like Howrah, Kozhikode, Titagarh, Kiranpur, and Fort Gloucester, all this was shut down. And after 1840, no big ships were built in India. The entire shipbuilding industry came to zero, and only after 1947 we revived it after independence with the feeling that we're doing it for the first time. So you see, we have forgotten our own history, and that is the real reason why I really wanted to write this, that we've forgotten our own traditions. And look at us after independence. Lothal has been discovered, other places have been discovered, but we haven't gone back to it. We haven't even rewritten our own history, and we are happy with the belief that we never knew shipbuilding, we never had a maritime navy. And I want to show you in my book, to show you how actually India was a center of global trade. Now here I have on one page a map of the 1st century. The 1st century AD map, done, has come as part of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. It was written by a trader and a sailor who came and traded. Now you will see that in that time, in the 1st century AD, India is at the center of a huge trade of arc, an arc of prosperity, an arc of trade, which extended from Europe to North Africa to India to Southeast Asia and all the way to China. Now India was controlling this trade through the fact that it could carry the trade in its own ships. It went to Southeast Asia, got spices. It took goods from Europe, brought them to India, carried them to Southeast Asia and carried them to China, because China loved the European goods. And it took the spices, brought them to India, carried them back to Europe. India was at the center of this trade, and you can see all the ports along the Indian coast where the trade was conducted. And I want to tell you that from the 1st century AD, you come to a 16th century AD map. Again, this is done, this is part of a writings of that time, the spice route that was done before, when the Portuguese came to India. Goa is mentioned in this map as one of the very important ports of trade. And it shows you again from the trade route remained unchanged for 1500 years, where India was the center. And in 1600, which is the time when the Mughals had already come into India, and then the Portuguese came and the British came, India at that time, there's a British economist called Angus Maddison, who has said that India had 25% of world GDP at that time. And in 1700, again when the same person has done the calculations, India had 27% of world GDP in 1700. Europe, all of Europe had 23% and India had 27%. 240 years later, in 1947, when the British left, India had 3% of world GDP. Now this is the destruction of the Indian economy that has been wrought during the colonial times. From 25% in 1500 to 27% in 1700 and to 3% in 1947. So this is, and we've forgotten our own glory, and we can revive it, and we can do the same thing if we work together as a group and we remember our old traditions. So actually this is what I have tried to bring out in the first part of my book, and I think that the naval tradition was so strong. The British don't want it to come out. They don't want to show that India had this control of the seas. In fact, the Marathas, who had also a very strong naval presence, they were taking on the British for a long time. I mean, till the political control after 1857, they were still taking on the British. So combined with destroying the shipping industry, the second industry that the British destroyed was the textile industry. And this would have brought out that textiles was the heart and soul of Indian trade. It not only employed the largest number of people, it still does actually. After agriculture, it is the largest employer, the single largest employer. And it was a matter of great pride and wealth that the Indian weaver, who was the creator, the designer and the executioner of that product, he was completely ruined because when the British came, they wanted to take control. They wanted the profit for themselves. They shouldn't go to the weaver or the craftsman. They took control of the village, and they didn't allow the villages which they took control of, which were the vast majority of the villages, they didn't allow those people to weave for anybody else. They said, you'll weave only for us, you will give us what to weave, and we will trade it. So the wealth passed from the weaver and the agricultural worker into the hands of the British, who were the middlemen. And I must say one thing, that today perhaps a lot of this continues the same. The middleman takes the profit, and the weaver, the creator, the one who creates this beauty, gets so little of it. So we seem to be so much in thrall of our British colonial powers that we are just not doing enough to revive our own sense of pride in what India was. And I'm talking here of an India that is really South Asia. We have our different sovereignties today, and we should be proud of all the different sovereignties that exist. But certainly we can do a lot of regional cooperation to bring this friendship together, to recreate our old glory.
So I think we have a lot to thank you for reviving or bringing focus on India's maritime tradition. And just to substantiate what you were saying, the oldest ship afloat in the world today is HMS Trincomalee, which is anchored in Plymouth Harbour. and it was built in Bombay by the Wadia master shipbuilders in the 17th, late 17th century. It's the oldest ship built of Indian teak. So all the ships built of British oak, etc. have disappeared. So Veena, moving on chronologically in your book, now you emphasize again that the Indian civilizational empires, or you have a name for them,
Father India.
Father India. Now, the provenance was neither military nor political, it was only cultural and trade. And that being so, the bonds must have been pretty strong, especially considering that all the religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and even Islam, went from India to Southeast Asia. But from a reading of your book, it seems that when Islam reached Southeast Asia, there seems to be a discontinuity. Now, is that your impression, that it was the end of something and the beginning of something new, or is it inconsequential?
No. Actually, there is a sentence in my book, and there is a page, where I've said absolutely clearly that again, I think this is the creation of history by the British, by the colonial powers. They gave the impression that it is Islam, the movement of Islam to the Southeast Asia, which caused the hiatus in the links between South and Southeast Asia. Actually, it is not so at all. Islam became another factor of strengthening the interaction between South and Southeast Asia. I'll just tell you about it. It is really the advent of colonialism in Southeast Asia that brought in the hiatus in the people-to-people interaction between India and Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia. Let me explain this a bit, because Islam actually went to Southeast Asia at a fairly late stage. You have writings, for example, you have Marco Polo, who was a very well-known traveler, who traveled in this region. And Marco Polo, can you hear me? Yeah, Marco Polo actually traveled there in 1292. So at the end of the 13th century is when Marco Polo traveled in South Asia and Southeast Asia. The designation further India was not meant in any sense as a colonial description, that there was any colonial relationship between South and Southeast Asia, but it was a description that when you came to India, only then you could, travel to Southeast Asia, because you used Indian ships. Very few Western ships went to Southeast Asia till a very late stage, and in fact Chinese shipping went at a very late stage. And you'll be interested to know that the earliest Indian kingdoms, which came up, as I said, in the early years of this millennium, in the 1st or 2nd century AD, the first kingdom was the kingdom of Hunan, which is in present-day Vietnam, in present-day South Vietnam. It came up a lot because of goods to be supplied to China on Indian ships, and Chinese shipping that time was primarily coastal. So they would come down their coast to pick up the goods from Funan, and Funan became the big place where it was the first kingdom. And Chinese shipping developed at a much later stage, and these outposts in Indochina, what is today Indochina, came up because of India's prowess in shipping. So the Western travelers, when they came to, and even Fahim, when he came to India, he traveled a lot on Indian ships. Even when he went back, there's a description of his use of Indian ships and stopping at Java and so on. So Marco Polo, when he came in 1292 and wrote about it, he traveled in Kedah, which is in Malaysia, and in Pasai. Samudra Pasai is the northernmost tip of Sumatra, which was a very, very big kingdom. Even today, if you know Aceh, the kingdom of Aceh, which is called in northern Sumatra, is very powerful, and they've been fighting for their own autonomy for a long time. And he describes in his writings, Marco Polo, that there was no Islam. There were Arab traders. Now, Arab traders were very, very active, and they settled in India in a big way. They settled in North Sumatra. There were a few of them in Malaysia. They were there even in China, the Arab traders. But the Arab traders were interested a lot in trading. They did no proselytization at all. There was no conversion at that time. And 1292, Marco Polo wrote them. But 1346, just about 50 years later, Ibn Battuta came and traveled. And he visited the same Samudra Pasai in north of Sumatra, and he said that the Sultan had converted to Islam, and there was a very, very powerful sultanate, you can say, in northern Sumatra, and that is in 1346. So very shortly after this, Islam had just about come to Southeast Asia when the Portuguese arrived. 1498, you had the Portuguese coming, crossing the Cape of Good Hope, and then coming to Cochin, and then in 1511 they took Malacca, they conquered Malacca. There was a Sultanate of Malacca. And in fact, there are very interesting writings about how the Sultanate of Malacca converted to Islam. The traders of Southeast Asia, of South India, the Tamil traders, they took Islam to Southeast Asia, to Malaya, to Sumatra. And just as it was earlier the Hindu-Buddhist traders who interacted with the kings and brought Hinduism and Buddhism, in the same way, the same traders who had converted themselves to Islam took that to the same kingdoms of Southeast Asia and converted the kings. But it was a very, very peaceful, Sufi-based conversion that took place. And to show that it has gone from Tamil Nadu and not from Gujarat, as some people say, is that you do find in Southeast Asia the Shafi sect of Sunni Islam, which is very predominant. Whereas in Gujarat you have a large number of Shias and you have the Hanafi sect of Islam, which is very prevalent in Gujarat. So that's another important reason to show that Islam went to Southeast Asia from South India, and it was a very existential regime there. You still find among the sultans of Malaya many old Hindu traditions where they are crowned. You know, there are many, and the colors they use, the yellow, the saffron, is very similar, but they are definitely very proud of their Islamic tradition, and that's a very important part of their life. And so Islam continued the traditions of friendship between South and Southeast Asia. There was no hiatus at all. And in fact, the same families continued to live there, continued to trade. It was not at all a factor of.
Okay, although the subtitle of your book says Intertwined Strands, in my limited personal experience of meeting Malaysians, my counterparts and so on, the relationship is lukewarm. I've never experienced overwhelming warmth or eagerness to interact with us. Now, can you put on your High Commissioner's, ex-High Commissioner's hat again and tell us what are the reasons for this distance? Is it the different colonial experiences, different attitudes toward the Japanese invasion, and all this finally sublimates in their attitude to the Indian diaspora living in Malaysia, whose condition seems to be going from bad to worse. There is discrimination against them. Fundamentalism is creeping into Malaysian society and politics, and generally it seems to be a bleak picture, both from point of view of our Indian diaspora in Malaysia and Indo-Malaysian relations. So please put on your diplomatic hat and tell us.
Okay, I think that during the British colonial period, when they took over full control, I want to, you spoke about the Dutch and you spoke about a visit to Indonesia. I want to draw a distinction here because the Dutch and the British divided Southeast Asia. The British took Malaya and the northern part of that, and the Dutch took Indonesia. Now there's a vast difference between how the British handled their sense of the pre-colonial period and the Dutch handled their sense. The Dutch actually allowed excavation. They actually emphasized the unity of civilizational traditions between pre-colonial and colonial. That is why the Indonesians today have no hesitation, as you very rightly said, talking about Pashupatani as the name of their submarine and talking about the Garud on their currency note. They see no contradiction at all. And they say it's a part of our tradition, it's nothing to do with religion. Our religion is Islam. We are proudly Muslim people and we are very devout Muslim people, but this is our tradition and our tradition has to remain. In Malaya and many parts of Southeast Asia, on the other hand, this tradition was broken. And what the British did was, they colonized the Malayans, they made the Malayans as agriculture, totally, nothing to do except rural. They brought in labor from India, Tamil Nadu, to work on the plantations. So they were the poor, impoverished. They brought in the Chinese for tin mining. And then when they brought in these people, and they made huge profits out of it, tin and plantation labor, these people were kept segregated. They were not allowed to mix. It was a kind of a racial discrimination that was brought into Malaya during that time. And this has had a tremendously terrible impact, adverse impact on the relationship, because even when the constitution was being drafted, you were talking about the Malay and the other. So the feeling of the Malay and the other became so strong in Malaysia, but it's not there in Indonesia. It's the same historical tradition. In Indonesia, you don't feel it at all. And they talk about it proudly as a shared civilization tradition. So it just shows how it is. And it's very interesting to know that the British wiped out the memory of pre-colonial interaction with India to this extent that the person who rediscovered it is none other than Rabindranath Tagore. And I've got a chapter on that in my book where I've said that Rabindranath Tagore, when he got the Nobel Literature Prize, was traveling all over the world, and he went to Holland, and there he met Dutch scholars, and he met former members of the Indonesian royal family, and they told him, please come to Indonesia and see the old tradition. And so he came and visited Malaya, and he saw this difference. And my book ends with a beautiful poem written by Rabindranath Tagore while he was traveling from Malaya to Sumatra, from mainland Malaya to Sumatra, where he talks about this, that we have forgotten each other. And let us please join hands again in friendship and in tradition. So this is the whole point, and this has been a huge, it casts a shadow, because within Malaysia the politics has been such that the Malay Islam politics is between the ultra-right-wing conservative past, the fundamentalist past, and the UMNO, which is the Malay National Organization Party. And each one is trying to out-Islamize the other. So they are doing their politics of fundamentalism, and the other communities are feeling very destroyed. In fact, 1 week ago there was a report from Malaysia that the most ancient Hindu temple, 4th century AD Hindu temple, has been destroyed in Malaya. And it didn't cover it, any news. So it's this kind of lack of interaction which is a very sad thing. And I think that Indian government, talking again from what I have always been doing, and now that I'm no longer with government, that Indian government should do more about the Indian diaspora. We do a lot for the rich Indian diaspora. We have the Pravasi Bharati Divas, and they come and they get awards, and they please bring your investment, and best friend. But what about the poor Indian diaspora? You have it in Trinidad and Tobago, you have it in the Caribbean, you have it in Malaysia, and these people must be looked after. And I hope that India is able to take up this diplomatic and economic challenge. So the question is very simple: education, bringing them into the mainstream, bringing the poor Indian Tamil into the mainstream. It's very easy to do, and it will get us goodwill from everybody. And the Chinese, for example, do stand up very much for the Chinese diaspora, whether they're poor or whether they're rich.
Thank you, Veena, for giving us those valuable insights into your book, which I think is a great contribution not just to maritime history, but I think to India's history. So thank you for writing the book, and I hope there's another one on the way. Thank you.
Because do you think that the traders were more of diplomats, who spread the cultural traditions unknowingly or knowingly?
Yeah. I must tell you that traders, when Coedes wrote his book, he made one very important point about the traders who went there. And right from he said they intermingled with the people. They lived there, they intermingled, they went right into the interior, they learned the language. They may have brought their own language, knowledge of Sanskrit, knowledge of traditional medicine, which was a very important impact, but they intermingled. And that was how they earned the respect and friendship of the people living there.
So without force, the traditions...
Yes, without force, because they earned, it was friendship, it was entirely diplomatic and soft power, And with that, the respect for the motherland was so much by people who never even visited. And you see in ancient temples in South India, some of the names of the people who visited are there. So there's a lot to be said for intermingling, for respecting local traditions, for learning languages, and for this friendship which should, oversee everything. There's a lot to be said for that.
In Bengal in particular, which has had so many different powers, there is this Pachari, for Narayan Puja and also for Lakshmi Puja, where they talk about this trader who went in a ship and his ship. I mean, I'm talking about the oral tradition, which continues to talk about these traders, the ship sinking, then him coming back, the divine intervention.
Yes, I must tell you about Bali Yatra.
Yeah.
Bali Yatra is a festival which exists even today on Kartik Purnima in November. So they set up these little lights, they put them in the sea to go towards Bali, because the ship journey started in winter, because the winds were such that you went in winter. And I remember when I was DG ICCR and the former great Chief Minister of Odisha, a submarine went actually, Patnaik, Viju Patnaik, a submarine went from the Navy to get taking the same route, Bali Yatra.
And also textiles, actually, I mean, we talk about the silk route and the silk textiles going from there. but the entire tradition of
Yes, very close. The whole Batik tradition, the Ikat tradition, the Ikat is very, very, yes, right up, very simple.
and these are two histories
Yes.
which, because one was oral and the other is more in terms of trade,
Yes,
these
yes.
have not been
They
paid
not
attention.
been brought up.
Thank you, Veena.
Thank you.
Thank you.